for last week. I trust you were well served by Lane. I enjoyed my time at Versailles with our kids, and I'm particularly grateful for those who work with kids. They are saints. I am not as gifted with kids. You may not think I'm gifted with adults, but I assure you it could be a lot worse. So it got to where at the end of, I had like 20, 25-minute increments with the kids. I did it 3 times. It got to where you could ask any question you want, and whatever question they were going to ask, I was going to make up an answer. When I say make up an answer, one question was, have you ever been to the beach? I've been to the beach. That's the truth. Here's the lie part. Last time I went to the beach, I had to wrestle a shark. Right now you got the kids' attention. All right, this is a run out the clock situation with first graders. At this point, you just that clock is ticking. It's like late in the second half of March Madness, basically what I was doing there at the end. So I'm very grateful for those who work with kids. Well, we've been looking at the judges, and we find ourselves looking at the third judge. This is, at least from the ones that we've seen so far, the most bizarre. Othniel, early on in chapter 3, is sort of the prototypical one, right? He's sort of the model, and so most of the judges will follow that model. Ehud is more detailed. Othniel just defeats people, and that's the end of the story. Ehud, we get a more dramatic story that is memorable, to say the least. But we get more tactics, and we get a little bit of background about him and what's all going on. And then we get this, where it's a single verse. An entire man's career of how God used him is summarized in a single verse. It's sort of like if you ever follow movies and stuff, where TV shows, movies, whatnot, they would shoot entire scenes, hire entire actors who never show up in the finished product. Can you imagine that? Like, I got hired and paid to act, and I spent days working on my scenes, and then I go to the movie theater, I walk the red carpet, and I take the photos, and I'm bragging to all my friends that I have a role in this big movie, and you watch it, and you're not in it. You're not in it. Well, here it's a similar, except your scene got cut down to one verse. But that is typical in Judges. You're going to get longer narratives. We're about to look at a longer narrative next. Next week, Lord willing, we'll look at Deborah and Barak. That's really 2 chapters. Chapter 4 is the narrative. Chapter 5 is the psalm. But we're going to see others. So that is to say, Shamgar is not the only minor judge. If you want to know the other ones, Tola, who is 2 verses. Yair is 3 verses. Ibzan is 3 verses. Elon is 2 verses. And Abdon is 3 verses. So this isn't the only time that we see this, but those others are largely grouped together. 2 of them are in chapter 10, 3 of them are in chapter 12. This one sort of stands alone, and I think we are given the impression not much is happening here. When you look at it, there's actually a lot to look at. So I know you're nervous because somehow we've got to strain 30, 40 minutes out of a single verse. I assure you it was not as hard as you might think, okay? So let's start here by looking at the man, Shamgar. So it says here, after him, that is Ehud, was Shamgar, son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. So who is this mysterious man, Shamgar? Well, although Scripture only dedicates a single verse to him, there's quite a bit we can say about him. First of all, we can look at his name. This name is a foreign name. And there's a couple of reasons why we know that. The main reason we know that right off the bat, if you ever study Hebrew, most of your words are 3 letters. So the root of most words is 3 letters. Now, that's not true of every word, but most of your words are 3 letters. And Shamgar is 4. So we already know that there's something going on here with this name. From what we can tell, at least what I was able to find, the name probably means sword. But the origin of the name itself remains a mystery. Our best guess is it comes from the Hurrians, which would make it mean, so if it's not sword, it could mean, if it's from the Hurrians, Shemig, the God has given. So already we're noticing something strange here. We have a man who's a hero in a series of heroes named after a pagan god who is supposedly the son of a pagan god. So right away we've noticed something weird about this guy going on here. Now, the Hebrews would call the Hurrians the Horites. So if you're reading your Old Testament, you come across the Horites, it's possible this name comes from the Hurrians or the Horite people. And so you're wondering, what in the world's going on here? Well, it could be, I think one good possibility is that he is a Hebrew who is so influenced by the Gentiles around him, he just takes a Gentile name. We do see examples of that throughout the Bible. I'll give you a good example of this. Moses. Now, you know in the story, he's named Moses because he was drawn out of the water. It's a good Hebrew name. But Moses is an Egyptian name. It means son of. So, Ramesses is the son of Moses of Ra. Thutmoses is the son of Thut. Those are two prominent pharaohs. And so we get several examples of this throughout the, even in the New Testament, we get some of that. We meet people with Greco-Roman names. But probably what is going on here is that he is not a Hebrew. He's not a Jew at all. And there's nothing in this passage or this verse that tells us he is actually a Hebrew. This is what makes this so striking about this. Well, if his name is that of a Horite, which is our best guess, and there's other reasons why we think that, his lineage is particularly interesting. He is said to be the son of Anath. Now, pause there for a minute. If you know nothing about Anath, you would think, okay, this is typical of ancient literature. Bob, the son of Bill. Okay, that's the way it's all written. But what if I told you that Anath is a woman? Are you already, something's triggered, right? Something's off about this. More than that, it's not that Anath is a woman. Anath is a goddess. You see? You see, it's just, it's such a little detail, and yet it's just jumping off the page that there's something bizarre about this man that you're not going to find elsewhere. A couple things. One is Anath is, first of all, she is simultaneously the consort of Baal, and she is the Canaanite goddess of war. So she shows up all over the place in ancient literature and archaeology. So she's a consort of Baal, which he has a lot of them, actually. So Ashtaroth, we talked about a few weeks ago, be a consort of Baal. It just depends on the myth and all that you're reading. But she would be one of those, makes her a prominent a goddess in Canaanite culture. But she's the goddess of war. So when the armies would line up, they would take Anath with them or make sacrifices to her. But what is interesting about Anath is that she's known outside of Canaan. She's actually known in Egypt. In fact, the Egyptians worshipped this Canaanite god with this name, with some of the same details. She appears in the Egyptian pantheon, where she functioned both as the goddess of war, much like she does in Canaan, but also as a protector of Egypt. Now, one of the things that we make a mistake here when we read this period of Judges is, and I'm guilty of this, is the way I think of it is Egypt's down here, Canaan's here. So I guess from y'all's angle, I meant to put a map up here. You got Egypt down here, you got Canaan here. Over here would be like the Philistines, by the Rifner, and you got like the Moabites and the Edomites and the Horites. So that's sort of the way we think about it. Is everything is just, it's like the 50 states. When you cross the Ohio River, you're not in Kentucky anymore. That's not actually the way this works. Egypt controlled much of Canaan. We know this archaeologically, and we know it historically, but archaeologically, I shared this several weeks ago, that we have an archaeological discovery where a series of Canaanite city-states were appealing to Pharaoh to come protect them. There was a group of nomads, I wonder who this could be, who was ravaging one city after another, taking possession of the land. And so they're crying out to Pharaoh, we can't stop these people. Come help us out. And so they're almost like vassal states of Egypt. So which would make sense that you would have a Canaanite deity in Egyptian culture, and that goddess would have a similar function in both places. And so notice, again, this is the son of Anath, son of a goddess. Now, it's doubtful his father is named after a goddess, right? This isn't 21st century Western world where male and female just goes out the window. No. So he seems to be the son of the goddess, either a mother with this name, or perhaps more likely, as if he is almost like a demigod. Not literally, but in the sense that as we'll see, his fighting prowess is so much that people would claim he was the child of the goddess of war. And we get this all the time in ancient literature, that people adopt a name, a nickname, if you will, to make their lineage greater than what it actually was. Perhaps that is what it is that we're getting here from Shamgar. So this could be a title. Actually, it more likely is a title. So it's not about his lineage. It's about what he has proven in battle. And this one story sort of goes along with that. In fact, he appears in 2 verses, and we'll this one in chapter 5 we'll get to. And in both instances, he is winning strategic battles. And so it's very likely that he is such a good military warrior, people would say, well, that's not just any ordinary man. That's got to be the son of a god. In fact, the son of the goddess of war. Now, that's a title you want. It may not be true, but that's a good title to have, particularly in the ancient world. So you'll see that both in his name, Shamgar, and in his title, he's associated with pagan gods. And what we find in Egyptian culture is that Pharaoh had a group of troops who were known as the troops of Anath. And so what we think is happening here is that Shamgar is probably part of these military leaders who, what's it, the term's leaving me, when you have like a private army, like you, mercenaries. It's very possible he is a Horite who has been hired as a mercenary of Pharaoh, who goes around and does all these sort of things. Now, maybe he's still doing that, or maybe while he's doing that, he's through a series of events, he happens to help the Hebrews. It's just really difficult to tell. But we do know around this time, these troops of Anath went to war with a people called the Sea Peoples. Guess who are the Sea Peoples in the Bible? The Philistines. So isn't it interesting that we read history and it says, okay, Egypt has a goddess of war named Anath. The Canaanites have a goddess of war named Anath. And that Egypt would hire Horites. And at one point, they fought against the Philistines. And then we read in the Bible a guy in a single verse who has a Horite name, likely, who is a son of Anath, which is a very similar title as the troop of Anath, who is he fighting? The Philistines. The location, the timing, all the little details make sense. Now, there's some conjecture here, but certainly the puzzle pieces seem to fit together. So what this means is, and I'm not sure I really knew this before I started studying Shamgar, is that we have God using a non-Hebrew to liberate the Jews. It's a striking story. And so what we have is a Gentile who is an instrument of God's providential redemption. His actions are viewed as divine deliverance, even if that was not his original interest. That's an interesting detail. It's doubtful that if we could talk to Shamgar right here, and I wouldn't recommend you trying to do that, but if we could talk to him right now and say, what do you think that you were put in the Bible? You were protecting the Hebrews. It's very possible he would say, I have no idea what it is you're talking about. I was at war with the Philistines. And one day, I just laid smack down on a whole bunch of them. Now, that was cool, right? I tweeted about it and put it on TikTok. Well, other than that, what are you talking about, the Hebrews? But because God is providential over the affairs of the world, it's exactly what it is that's happened here. So what time did he operate? Well, we've talked about this in Judges. Chronology is difficult to come by. But a couple things we can note here. One, he is a temporary of Deborah. He's mentioned in the Song of Deborah. This is the other time he's referenced in the Bible. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath. In the days of Yael. Of course, Yael is one of the main characters in the Deborah story. So he's clearly a contemporary of Deborah. And according to this, in verse 31, it says after him, which suggests this comes right after Ehud. So there seems to be a middleman, as the text implies, between Ehud and Deborah. Now remember, Judges, it isn't that they're liberating all of Israel. It's pockets, it's tribes. So while Ehud's over there, and Deborah shows up over here, Shamgar's here. And so we can place this time somewhat. So in this very short time span, what it is we have Israel delivered from the Moabites, the Philistines, and the more broadly Canaanites. And it just seems to happen around the same period of time. So this is clearly a time of great violence, chaos, and uncertainty. Well, that's the man. What about his works? What did he do? Okay, what did the man do? Well, as we just had, he shows up only one other time in the Bible. It's clearly him. The writer wants us to make the connection. Notice what he's doing here. The highways were abandoned and travelers kept to the byways. So if you take what's going on here, although we're not told very much, it's clear that the roads are blocked. And Shamgar comes with an army or whatever, and he clears the roadways. This would be a military responsibility. Trade and other economic benefits can only happen if there is the way to do it. I'll give you a good modern example of this. After World War II, guess who took over the world's waters? United States of America. You will find Navy ships all over the world. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is to keep trade going. Because everyone's afraid that if you didn't bother anyone, the states are going to leave you alone. But if you start messing around with piracy and other nonsense, there's a big old Navy carrier over there loaded with weapons. And so what this has allowed is for trade to happen between nations, and as a result, the world right now is richer than it has ever been. There are less people in poverty right now than ever in human history. It's not even close. We have the largest population the world's ever seen, and more people are eating, and less people are starving to death. In fact, you could say that where you find starvation, it is caused not by the lack of resources, but by political will. Is that governments are starving their own people. And it's incredible. And the way we're able to do that is because we keep the lanes open. And it seems to me that's what Shamgar's doing. Is that Shamgar, he gets a report, hey, can't get access to the road, and he grabs his torch and pitchfork and he just goes and takes care of it. Right? So he's clearly a man of war and battle hardened and everything. But what's interesting is not just what he did, though that is intriguing, but how his story is told. Remember that Othniel is the standard. This reads nothing like those other stories. For example, in most of the Judges, it mentions that Israel sinned. So if you go back to the story of Othniel, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. You read the story of Ehud, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. You come to Shamgar, look, this dude grabbed an ox goad and he went to town. We don't get any of these details. It's just so what's important isn't just what details we get, but what details are missing. Now, not every judge is introduced this way, but most of them are. Because we are to see the judges as God's judgment upon Israel for sin and God's grace for liberating them from that act of discipline. Shamgar's different. It's just he shows up and takes out a few Philistines and thus helps the Israelites out. It's just very different from everything else. And we're not even told if Israel, at least this area of Israel, is under divine judgment. We're just not told that. It's just so intriguing. Why isn't there? Let's look at the enemies, the Philistines here. So Shamgar killed 600 of the Philistines. We've talked about them a little bit. They were not native of the Canaanites. So they come from like the Mediterranean area, and they try to come down to Egypt. The Egyptians didn't like that. They end up landing in Canaan. They are the sea peoples. In fact, we get in the Bible, here's one verse. They are from Kaftor, which is Crete. And we know archaeologically, we talked about this weeks ago, archaeologically, DNA supports this. We found skeletons of the Philistines. and we do a DNA test. Have you all, any of you all done your DNA thing to figure out your ancestry? Look, I am as Scott, Irish, British as you can get, minus the accent. You know, if I could get that Scottish accent, I would settle for an Irish one. But I mean, that's where I'm from. It's like 90%. I'm right there from the islands. Well, we do that with all the skeletons we find, and it looks like they come from that area, as the Bible tells us. So they arrived between the 12th and 11th centuries, and they become a problem. So the Philistines are basically built around 5 city-states. It is Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. You remember, Goliath comes from Gath. So Philistines keep creating problems. And so we saw this in Judges 1. Judah also captured Gaza, of the Philistines, and its territory, Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. So we saw in chapter 1 that as the people of Israel are taking possession of the land, they're pushing the Philistines back, mentioned here, 3 of the 5 major city-states of the Philistines. So it's not surprising we read later that the Philistines are pests. They want their property back. They want their land back. And God uses Shamgar to go against them. So it makes sense then that Shamgar is likely a Horite mercenary under the rule of Egypt, who is used to fight the Philistines, who are a problem for the Egyptians, yes, but they're also a problem for the Israelites. And so his focus may be, I got to do what Pharaoh tells me to do, but God uses that role to liberate the people of Israel. Maybe it's in a minor way, but it was certainly a memorable way that the Israelites needed God to intervene in this specific way. And on one occasion, he wiped out 600 Philistines. On another occasion, he cleared the roadways. But here you have this pagan military leader who's not a Hebrew. God uses him multiple times for the good of Israel. But what about the weapon he uses? An ox goad. Anyone ever use an ox goad? And you're going to show me your age if you say yes, right? I mean, go downstairs and say, all right, students, what's an ox goad? And they'll say, well, what's an ox, right? That's what they'll say. So that sounds bad. Again, we're not given any details about what the Philistines were doing, what the oppression was. We're not given any of that. The main thing is he used an ox goad, which I don't know if you know this or not. That is not a sword. Is that fair? Is that fair? It is not a military weapon. It's a farming weapon, farming equipment. Now, we'll come to this. Ehud had the 18-inch dagger, right, in his left, and he just, right? What does this cat got? He's got farming equipment. And somehow, with a little bit of farming equipment, he was able to take out the enemy. So what do we, yeah? Cattle prod. What translation you got? Really? See, the Christian Standard Version has that. Interesting. It's very similar purpose. So Don, you know what I'm going to ask? What's the message have? So cattle prod, same purpose, right? But yeah, it's interesting. While Don looks that up, one of the things we think that may be happening here is an ancient version of gun control. Now, I'm using a politically charged term, for one, to keep your attention and to give you a point of reference to understand what's going on here, not to get you spitting mad or happy. I don't know which side of the aisle you're on. We do know this. During the days of King Saul, the Israelites were under the oppression of the Philistines. This is early in King Saul's reign. And what the Philistines did, so this is a couple hundred years later from Shamgar. The Philistines said, no weapons whatsoever. Did you find it, Don? It is cattle prod. Look at there. Interesting. So here's the reference here, 1 Samuel 13. Now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears. But every one of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, and his sickle. So on the day of the battle, there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of many of the people. Can I prove this to you? A few years later, a big tall man is going to come out to the Israelites. What does the little guy have? Not a sword. Now, he's given a sword by the king, yes. He's got a slingshot. think perhaps one of the reasons why the Israelites are so good with things like the slingshot is because for so many years they couldn't use a sword. Let me tell you, it's not a political comment. You can ban weapons all you want. We will still learn to kill each other. We'll still do it. And what you got, Don?
Martial arts weapons were
Yes. So when I was in karate, we talked all the time. The bow staff, to carry, water. I had the kamas. They were basically a sickle. And that was my favorite weapon that I never learned. We did that. Where do the nunchucks come from? Where does the sai come from? All that. Yes, that was cool because you took practical, everyday tools and you used them as weapons. And that certainly is the case. However, what's interesting about this is, by the way, just make a quick note. You know the story of the axe head that goes into the water? Okay. One of the reasons iron was so expensive is because of this policy. The Philistines had a monopoly on iron. If you didn't have iron, you can't make weapons. At least not weapons that the Philistines, right? They had the bigger guns, if you will. So this was part of that policy. So to have an iron axe head was to have some connections that was very, very expensive. So when that goes into the river, the Jordan River, he is going to go from being a student to a slave. That's all because of these policies that have been going on in Israel and Canaan at this time. Well, this was, of course, an oppressive means designed to keep the Jews subdued. We'll look at Samson here in a minute. But Samson liberates Israel without a sword. He does it with a donkey's jawbone. He does it by pushing the pillars over. We'll look at that in some detail when we get to Samson. Because we have found similar things that have pillars there. But one wonders if a similar policy is in effect in Israel at this time, or Canaan at this time. We do get a hint of this. Now, I showed you Judges 5, verse 6 mentions Shamgar. Here's 2 verses later. Judges 5, 8. When new gods were chosen, this is a song, okay, so it's out of context. Then war was in the gates. Was shield or spear to be seen among 40,000 in Israel? It's interesting. One is a tool of defense. One is a tool of offense. A spear was the most common weapon of war. We think of swords, mostly because of medieval times, but spears was the main weapon. Especially if an army's charging after you, you got you a 6-foot spear, however long it is. You got an advantage. So we get a hint of this policy before King Saul. So it's very possible that the Philistines have enacted this policy early on. And here Shamgar realizes, I got to do something, but no one has any weapons. They've all been confiscated. It's gun control. Again, if I could use that phrase just to make a modern reference to it. So the ox goad was a farming tool, 8 feet long, used to prod oxen or cattle. We don't raise oxen, at least here in Kentucky, as much. We're more cattle folks. And so it was to prod them along with the plows. It had a dull metal point at one end and a blade on the other. That blade's the important part. So yes, it was meant for prodding oxen along, but it did have something sharp to it. Now you could use this. Now what's interesting, this tool shows up all over the Bible. Of course, it's an agricultural culture. Let me give you 2 examples where it's used metaphorically. Ecclesiastes 12, the words of the wise are like goads. Here it is, cattle prod, ox goad. And the nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings they are given by one shepherd. Acts 26, and when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. You King James, it's because I hear Johnny Cash in my head. It's hard for thee to kick against the pricks, right? And so this is the same tool. It's the same tool. It's just a goad. It's a cattle prod. Now, ironically, it is a tool used to guide oxen not to control the Philistines. Now, pause there. You wonder if this metaphor is to be applied to the Philistines. That what the Israelites have to do is they've got to use this tool to sort of shepherd them, to get rid of them, to get them out of town. So the tool you would use for oxen, you're going to use for the Philistines. So this highlights the unlikely nature of the weapon because it has a blade on it, but it's not designed for killing people. It's not designed for that. So one may think of grab your torch and pitchforks. 'Cause that's kind of what he does. I'm going to go to war. What you got that I can use? You got any weapons? No, I'm just a simple farmer. And he looks in the back of his barn. There's an old ox gourd, maybe one his grandpappy gave him. That'll do. No, I could fight with that thing. So he gets a victory. Now notice here, we're told nothing in terms of military strategy or an army or anything else. All we know is Shamgar showed up with a farming tool and wiped out 600 Philistines. Did he do it with the help of others? I don't know. Were they trained in the army? Maybe it was a specific tribe. Maybe it was a militia. Maybe it was just a group of rednecks. I don't know. Could have done it all by himself. We're not given any details here. But you'll notice here, the phrase says there at the very end, he saved Israel. In fact, notice, your translation probably says this. It says, he also saved Israel. So the language is for us to see two things. One, he won an unlikely victory, and he saved Israel. That word is so interesting. Both are related, yes. I think the killing of the Philistines leads to the saving. But it's interesting. Nowhere in Judges is Shamgar called a judge. Rather, this is the word deliverer. Now, one commentary says, in Judges, there are 12 judges, 7 deliverers. My math could not figure that out. I did a word study. I tried to look at the outline, who everyone is. I can't figure out where those numbers are coming from, but it sounds really good. 12 judges, 7 deliverers. And Shamgar will be numbered among those deliverers. That's why the King James Version doesn't say that he saved them. It says that he delivered them. But again, we were struck here. Who is the one doing the delivering? It is a pagan Gentile who probably has no interest in the well-being of the Hebrews. It's just an interesting little detail there. Well, I want to highlight this. Saw the man whose works. What about the parallels? Does anything about this story sound familiar? I've always noticed this about Shamgar. Shamgar, to me, was always the cheap remake of the original. Does that make sense? Or maybe later you get, okay, so Dune is out. Not saying you should watch it or not, but there's now 2 movies telling the story of one book. Or you can go back and see a significantly cheaper version of it from a long time ago. That is, well, I tell you, Sting is like the main villain in it. The singer Sting. Is that all you need to know about this? Or maybe what you can do is you can watch the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe that came out when Man and I were in college. It's a good movie. I love it. There's a BBC version of it. It's a little on the cheap side. Same story, same parallels. One is the nicer version than the other. And I've always thought Shamgar is the cheaper version of it. It's just one verse. So let me give you a few examples of this. What about Samson? Does this story sound like Samson? Yeah. Here you go. Samson found a fresh jawbone of a donkey. Why is he? Here's a guy, Nazarite, touching a dead body. Remember that? We'll come back to it. And he put out his hand and took it. So again, he's touching dead bodies. He breaks every Nazarite vow, story of Samson. And with it, he struck 1,000 men. Oh, by the way, who are these men? Philistines. And it's the same story. Yeah. What about Moses? Remember, Moses gets in trouble. He tries to deliver Israel by taking matters in his own hands. He failed and has to flee. Shamgar succeeds. He succeeds. Moses tries to kill 1 man. Shamgar kills 600. And throughout the Old Testament, we get random stories of men, single fighters, fighting off a large multitude of people. Now, if you like action movies, period pieces, you love these scenes. You want to see Aragorn from Lord of the Rings just take on everybody. When you watch The Gladiator, you want to see him take on everybody. You don't watch, I don't know, James Bond. I don't know, whoever it is. You want to see him, he's just going to take on everybody. John Wick, I'm not recommending him, just saying. So we get several of these examples in the Bible. For example, Eleazar, the son of Dodo. That's an unfortunate name. 2 Samuel 23. And next to him, among the 3 mighty men of David, was Eleazar, the son of Dodo, son of Ahohai. I don't know which one I don't want the most. He rose and struck down the Philistines. Interesting detail. until his hand was weary. I remember preaching through this when we went through David. His hand still clung to the sword. The language is as if it's stuck. He can't hardly wield it anymore, but he will not let go of that sword. He will not let go of it. And you sort of wonder now on this end of the story of Saul and Judges if the possession of a sword is itself a right they don't want to give up. Because if we let the Philistines win, we can't fight against them anymore. They take all of our weapons away. So he clings to that sword with all that he has. And he's just the last fighter, just swinging at it. And the Lord brought about a great victory that day, and the men returned after him to strip the thing. So basically he gets abandoned. And then once he kills everybody, then they all come back. Yeah, how convenient. I got a joke there, but I'm going to save it. What about a guy by the name of Shammah? Interesting, sounds a lot like Shamgar. But Shammah, the son of Agi, the Hararite. You get this also in 2 Samuel 23. Next to him was Shammah, the son of Agi, the Hararite. The Philistines gathered together at Lehi, not to be confused with the place in the Book of Mormon. And the men fled from the Philistines. There's the Philistines again. But he took his stand and struck down the Philistines. The Lord worked a great victory. It reads as if it's one guy, pulling out his sword and saying, I'm going to go down. I'm going to go down swinging. Very similar story here. Let me give you one more example of this. This is Jonathan and his armor bearer. The story reads weird. Some say it's just Jonathan. Some say it's armor bearer. Some say it's both. I don't know. 1 Samuel 14. And Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, and his armor bearer after him. They fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed them after him. And that first strike, which Jonathan and his armor bearer made, killed about 20 men within, as if it were half a furrow's length in an acre of land. So he basically clears out a farm with one strike. I don't know what that means, but it sounds like with the right background music, it could be a cool scene in a major movie. Yeah? So you've seen this pattern here. Shamgar is the Gentile version of that. Like we've read this story before, or we're going to read this story again if you keep reading through your Bible. I think what's going on here is something that we are told in the book of Joshua. Joshua 23, for the Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations. And as for you, no man has been able to stand before you to this day. One man of you puts to flight 1,000. Since it is Yahweh your God who fights for you, just as he promised you, be very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. You see the connection? The surprising part is that promise is made to the Israelites. Who fulfills it initially is a Horite, a Hurrian. So you see why this story jumps off the page. Because I've been trained, if I'm reading through my Bible, I've been trained, okay, maybe there's going to be a story where God is going to empower a single individual who alone will deliver Israel. We've gotten hints of this. Othniel rounds up the boys and he gains a big victory. The same guy who was the son-in-law of Caleb. And then we meet Ehud, who makes the first strike. He by himself stabs the king, escapes, but then he rounds up the troops. So we're getting closer to this narrative. But the first person who supposedly, at least in the narrative, does it all by himself, he's not a Hebrew. He's a mercenary of the Egyptians. Boy, that just jumps off the page. And then when we get his parallel, it is of a man who is given everything by God, gifted with strength and power and ability, and he throws it all away. And so in the time he looks like Shamgar, he has violated that oath by touching a donkey's jawbone. Isn't that incredible? One verse. One verse. And the narrator is screaming these things at us if we'll just read it. Absolutely amazing. So what do we do with this? All right, so what I have in my notes is who cares, okay? So what do we do with this? Let me give you just two things, and we'll be done. One is contrast. This is a story of contrasts. We said this earlier, and the previous narrative involves the story of Ehud using a double-edged dagger, whereas Shamgar uses an ox goad. What a contrast. God used the sharpened weapon. He also used the ox goad. He used both. Yael will next use a tent peg. It's amazing. So we go from a double-edged sword hidden in a military leader's code, and he happened to be left-handed because he's a Benjaminite, and we talked about that. They are all good with their left hand, ambidextrous. And then we get an ox goad, and God delivers Israel through an ox goad. And then we get in chapter 4 a story of how God delivered Israel through a person's tent peg. What do you think is the purpose of this? God doesn't need the weapons of man to deliver his people. Isn't that good news? Isn't that good news? One of the things I've found with Christianity, and I was sanctified, and still am in many ways, through Christian rock music. Don knows. I could rock out to a good, yeah. But I went through this pattern where I thought that if people would like my music, they will like my God. And so I was on all the street teams, and I would go to concerts, and I would advocate, like, hey, you like Limp Bizkit, you should try Pillar. You like Korn, you should try Project 86. Or Spoken, there you go. And I would do this, like we're cool too. And American evangelicals still buy into a celebrity culture. You remember when Kanye got converted? Remember how we made him our new patron saint of sanity? Justin Bieber got converted. I mean, we could just go down the line of all these people who get saved. They have a testimony. And then we say, okay, you can run all of our conferences. We'll put you on all of our social media and TV stuff. Now you will be our representative, only to discover that what Paul told Timothy, to not take a new believer and give them a sort of position like that because they're not ready for it. We completely bypass it. Why? Because we think that the only way we reach the world is through the world's means. I'm really bad about this. I am guilty of this. But God can take an ox goad and slay 600. He can take a tent peg and bring a nation to its knees. Isn't that good news? He can take the weak and the infirm and the broken and change the world. If you don't believe me, he took a man who knew a thing or two about a tent peg. His name was Jesus, a carpenter's kid. And the tent peg went through his wrists and his feet. He changed the world. Changed the world. Well, Ehud was a Benjaminite warrior. Shamgar was a Horite. Deborah was a woman. Now that sounds condescending, but in the ancient world, women didn't do this. God used her. It's actually Barak who's the scaredy cat, not Deborah. She's the one with courage. It's amazing. God can use anyone. God can do anything. He doesn't need our help, although we and people and events are the means by which God does amazing things. One last thing. God uses unlikely heroes. We've talked about that. How unlikely. So if when we entered Judges, you're thinking, this is the weirdest book in the Bible, other than maybe Song of Solomon, unless you're a middle school boy. And you're thinking, we're just going to read about weird Hebrews. And then all of a sudden we encounter a guy who probably didn't even know he's been used by God. The Bible's full of examples like this. In fact, if you missed that reading the Bible, then you didn't read it. God doesn't primarily use the rich, the wealthy, the powerful, and the influential. He uses a shepherd boy to kill a giant. He uses a carpenter to save the world. He uses a runaway murderer, son of an adopted son of Pharaoh, to deliver Israel without a sword, but with a shepherd's staff. You could do all the stories. Who was Abraham? A pagan from Ur, near Babel. Right? Who's Jacob? A mama's boy. Who's Joseph? Kind of a punk, right? An enslaved prisoner punk, we might add. Who are these guys? They're nobodies. God uses unlikely heroes. Later, God is going to use another Gentile. Just to give you one example, and his name is Cyrus. And Isaiah says Cyrus is going to come. And God's going to use that pagan, actually calls him Messiah, the anointed one. God's going to anoint him to liberate us. This is what God does. The 12 disciples, none of them were wealthy except for maybe Matthew, and that wasn't a good cause of his wealth. They're fishermen. They didn't know much about tent pegs. They could tell you a lot about hooks. Yet God used them. Isn't that good news? You could be a country bumpkin from Owen County or Franklin County. You could be a nobody without a following on social media, without training in how to handle the media. Simply through faithfulness, if God so wills, he'll change the world through unlikely people. One more example. And that would be a country hick from North Carolina who went to a tent revival in his home county. Billy Graham got saved. Do you know who preached at that tent revival? That's my point.
Billy Sunday?
No. Billy Sunday is either at the end of his career or he's dead. Is a guy by the name of Mordecai Ham. What a terrible name is that? Mordecai Ham. Let's bring back those other names we were making fun of earlier. Dodo. Mordecai Ham. Know anything about him? That's the point. He's from Kentucky. Fire and brimstone preacher, early 20th century. He just did tent revivals all over the place. Anywhere he could set up, he'd preach. One day he finds himself in North Carolina. And there in the back was a rebel who was invited to a tent meeting. And God gripped his heart. And no one has preached to more people and led more people to Christ than that country bumpkin from North Carolina. God uses unlikely heroes. That's good news. Good news. Well, shall we pray? And you're getting out early. Again, it's like 3 times in a row for y'all. All right, let's pray. Our Father, thank you for your love and your mercy. Thank you for your word. What an encouragement it is.